Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We've got about 25 people on the call so far, and we always have a number of people hop on in the first few minutes. But I've got 1:30 as my official iPhone time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. As you know, we have these calls monthly to share information about what's going on with invasive species in Florida, as well as provide updates from CISMAs and the Florida Invasive Species Partnership. So today on our call, I'm actually really excited about this presentation. Dr. Lieurance with the UF IFAS assessment has been working on getting a number of plants added to Florida's noxious weed list. She's going to talk more about what that means and why that's important. But she's been doing this work with a lot of partners in the CISMAs who have familiarity or have worked with the plants she's been working on in the field, and really don't know anything about that process. So I'm excited to kind of learn how one goes about getting a plant added to the noxious weed list, and maybe even be thinking about how we can continue to support this work and get more plants listed as needed. So again, excited to hear this presentation. And I want to invite folks, if you have questions that come up throughout the presentation, feel free to type them in the chat box as the presentation is going on, in case you're concerned you might forget the question. And at the end, we will have some time to take questions. You can always unmute and ask it then, but that just gives you an opportunity to capture it. And also at the end, when we do announce time for questions, you're welcome to type it in the chat box or just unmute and chime in. But we will cross that bridge when we get there. And then we also have some great FISP and CISMA updates. We're going to talk a little bit about some stuff that's coming up in 2020. We've got some important dates for you guys. So with that, I don't want to waste any time. I want to go ahead and get into this presentation. So give me just a moment to put Deah in control. Deah, you should be able to click on the screen and get going.
All right, thanks a bunch. Can everybody hear me? I'm hoping.
I can hear you, so we should.
Yeah, I'm really excited to share this information. I've been involved in getting 3 plants through committee so far, but I wanted to just talk briefly before I get into the actual presentation about how we started with the first 2 species. So with my work with Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council, I am the legislative chair. I feel like I've been the legislative chair forever. But one of the things we were looking to do was some more, proactive community kind of efforts on behalf of FLEPPC. And we had been talking with some folks at Florida Native Plant Society, and they had come to us about, quote unquote, getting a bunch of plants listed. And this got me thinking and connecting with some of the people I work with at Florida Department of Ag and Consumer Services about, just what it means to get something listed. So we got together and we put together a list of species that we thought maybe warranted listing. And through FLEPPC, with help of Kristen Mason, we prepared 2, we sort of had this list, ranked them, and put up the 2 species that were the highest ranked by our board members that we thought should go on the list. So I put together the Lieurance japonica petition, and Kristen put together that cat's claw one. So that's just the history of how we got involved. Whoops. So taking a step back, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what it means to be put on this list. So as you know, in Florida, we've got a ton of lists, plant lists, with some prominent ones at the forefront, those being our regulatory lists, federal, Florida, noxious weed lists. We also have a Florida aquatic prohibited list. And then non-regulatory lists like the FLEPPC plant list and the IFAS assessment list that we put together. Just a side note, the IFAS assessment list is a list that, while not regulatory to everybody else, in the state. It is regulatory within the University of Florida. In that, if you work for the University of Florida, you can't recommend a plant that we've determined it's either high risk to be invasive or it is invasive. The FLEPPC list has been used in some regulations around the state, or zoning. If you're doing some planning for development, some localities will use the FLEPPC list for that. But it's really the Florida noxious weed list, the Florida prohibited aquatic list, and that federal noxious weed list that have any real legal ramifications. So the picture here, you know, this is Rosary P. This is one that's been on the list for a while, but you can see the definition there. You have to have impacts. It has to threaten, you know, the Florida ag or endangered, threatened, or commercially exploited plant species. And, you know, really being able to talk about those economic and environmental impacts is important when you're trying to get one of these plants listed. So the process, it's pretty simple. There's a petition that you fill out. You know, you provide the petitioner, or if you're filing on behalf of a group, your group puts together the data and the information to submit that petition. And then you send it to FX. I believe you send it right to Greg Hodges, FDAX. The instructions are on the cover page of these petitions. But once they receive your petition, that's when they schedule a meeting. They don't have regular meetings. They just schedule meetings when things come up. So they might have one every 2 years, or they might have 2 in 1 year, just depending on the demand. But once that meeting is set up, that's where we talk about the evidence, and that their committee votes. Once it's voted on, then it moves on to the lawmaking phase. In this case, it's a rule, which, you know, in Florida, we have laws and we have rules. Rules are a little bit different. I honestly couldn't tell you if they're harder to get through or easier to get through, but this is technically a rule change. And so once it goes up to legislature, they have to approve that change. And just looking at the history of the amended versions of this list, it looks like they formally release those around Christmas, whenever there's a change to be had. So taking a step back and looking a little more in depth at the petition, basically, if you go to this website, you can download a PDF of the petition. It is fillable, but I've never fit the information that I needed to get to the committee into the space that they have on that form. So definitely, you know, fillable PDFs are kind of the bane of my existence, but this is how you get to it. And then the information that you supply, things like your life history. So they ask questions about taxonomy of the plant, growth habit, history of invasiveness. So you'll be talking about whether, you know, how is the habitat suitable for Florida? How's it disperse? And here's the, you know, really the important part here is these economic and environmental impacts. So as we know, controlling invasive plants can be very expensive. So that's a really something to hit on when you're talking about the economic impacts, but also think about how one of these non-native invasives can affect recreation or agriculture. So broader economic impacts, if you can document those. In terms of environmental impacts, you can see the Melaleuca fire here I always use this picture in my presentations because it's so dramatic, but but you know, these environmental impacts can be this obvious, or you could talk about things like impacts to threatened and endangered species. And the most important thing is to really convey how the inclusion of the species will hinder the invasion of that species. How's it going to slow it down or stop it? So this is really important. And I'll talk about this when we get into a specific example. So once the petition goes in, it's submitted, then you attend this formal public meeting, and you know, this is with the agency, the committee members for the noxious weed folks at FDAX, but also experts are invited. You know, if it's a horticulture species that, you know, species that might influence sort of that part of our industry, you know, they're represented in the room. We also, you know, I've been invited as an expert, you know, just to talk about, you know, risk assessment, and sat in as an ecologist. There's weed science folks from the Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants. But you know, these are announced meetings if you know how to find them, so anybody can attend. But once you're in the room, the petitioner will make the case, and then the group discusses. So you really just walk through. I believe I gave about a 5 or 10 minute overview of the petition, why I thought it was really important to get a species listed, and then we just sort of have a group discussion until, you know, the committee votes. And again, once that vote happens, then the decision sent to Tallahassee for that rule change. Here's where you know, it gets a little murky for me, because I haven't seen the side of the process, but you know, from what I understand, this is just when it can get into the legislative session. This can sometimes be delayed, as was the case with the petitions that we put forth in, I believe it was 2017 that we got these two species in. So for the Japanese honeysuckle and the cat's claw vine, they were approved. You know, the cat's claw vine, we barely talked about it. It was pretty obvious that inclusion would be helpful to sort of slow down or you know, bring awareness to the invasion by cat's claw. There's a little more discussion with that honeysuckle, just because it's so widespread. But ultimately, these were both approved. But that formal listing was held up by, you know, that was a big year. Last year was a big year for legislature dealing with some things that were a little more important, arguably, than a noxious plant list. So we had a big hurricane and a pretty devastating tragedy in South Florida. So these should be added in the next session. So what we did this year is, you know, I've been thinking a lot about beach Vitex, and I was thinking, you know, this is a species that I think we can get on the list while it's pretty early in its invasion, at least in this part of the United States. So we have 4 points in Georgia through EdMaps, 5 points in Alabama, and 45 points in Florida. But you can see here in the number of points in the Carolinas, you know, this is the point of introduction for beach Vitex, and it's a little more established. So to me, I was just thinking this would be a really good chance to try to get this listed. And I personally started getting involved and started thinking about beach Vitex because I spend a lot of my downtime on St. George Island and up by Apalachicola, and I noticed a couple of populations. I knew of one planting on the island, but I saw a couple other ones. You know, like if I just happen by these two populations, you know, how much else is around here? So that's sort of my background into it. Oops. So the invasion curve is something that should be pretty familiar to everybody, but if not, I'll take you through it briefly. But basically, once a species is introduced to a landscape, as you move through time, the area occupied increases, and so do your impacts and damage to the environment, but also your management costs. But also here, the longer a plant's in the landscape and the more area it's taking up, our odds of eradicating that species really go down. So once you're up in, I don't know if you can see the cursor, but once you're up in this asset-based protection area, that's where we're really just trying to, keep it just enough to where we can still enjoy some part of the environment. So this is sort of like a maintenance control area. But down here in eradication and containment, this is where we can sort of mitigate some of those impacts and try to keep it from becoming a problem. I believe that we are in this part of the curve when it comes to Vitex in Florida and probably Georgia and Alabama as well. So over here at the assessment, one of the things that I wanted to do was get beach Vitex into our database. I ran a predictive tool model on it. It's basically a risk assessment screening tool based on the Australian weed risk assessment modified for Florida's climate, precipitation, and soil type. And this one came out very high. Anything over a 7 is high risk, and beach Vitex came in as a 21. And some of the factors that contributed to this were, it's long-lived, fast-growing, high fecundity. But we'll get into some more of these details when we talk about the petition. Similarly, the USDA IFAS PPQ group, there's a risk analysis group up in Raleigh. They ran a risk assessment on Vitex as well and determined that it was also a high-risk species. This model is a model that's based on the Australian model as well for risk assessment. But one thing that they do that I think is pretty cool is they sort of divide up the risk potential into establishment and spread and those impacts. And right here, this black dot, beach Vitex squarely sits in relatively high impacts, and also that potential to spread and establish is high as well. This graph over here with the box, and this is an uncertainty analysis. So for each question in that risk assessment protocol, you assign a level of certainty to your answer, and that's used in a risk at-risk model that does Monte Carlo simulations to sort of give you an idea of the uncertainty around your prediction by using the uncertainty around each of your questions. So this one, Vitex, even with all 5,000 Monte Carlo simulations, it still sits squarely at 100% high risk for invasion. So we're pretty certain this thing is bad or potentially bad for us. So here's some of the information that I used in the petition. Here, suitable habitat. This species inhabits sandy dunes and rocky areas above the high tide line. This photo down here is from the Carolinas, where you see a big clump of Vitex in a dune. And this photo here is from St. George Island. This is in sort of a rocky bank on the bay side, Apalachicola Bay. So, this one is particularly hard to control because, the plant's growing in and around those rocks. The plant prefers full sun, and it does have a high tolerance to both drought and salt. It grows very fast, very short generation time, and it does reproduce both sexually and asexually. It puts off a bunch of, if you haven't seen this, we'll have a lot of pictures, but it puts off these dense woody branches that intertwine. And while this, if the species takes hold on the dunes, everybody loves the sea turtles. I believe they're all either threatened or endangered, all the sea turtles that visit Florida's beaches. So it's thought, as far as I know, there's no direct evidence of this, but you could look at it and just make an assumption that these branches are going to impede sea turtles to come up and nest. And if they do successfully nest, those hatchlings are going to get stuck in those branches. So it will impede the hatchling success as those little turtles try to make it back down to the water. Also, the encroachment into critical nesting habitats is a concern. We have a lot of, ground nesting shorebirds, and some of these are also either endangered or threatened. And a very specific case here with the Perdido Key beach mouse. Perdido Key, I believe Rick O'Connor said that there was some Vitex on Perdido Key. If Vitex really took hold on Perdido Key, this very adorable little mouse would lose its habitat. It's specific to this one area. So this is really good information for, if you're preparing one of these petitions, if you can do these direct impacts or potential impacts to, Florida's threatened and endangered species, and that's not just not just animals, plants as well. Talk a little bit about how hard it is to kill this plant. This is just a bulleted list of some of the advice about killing or managing beach Vitex, but pretty much all of the recommended treatments involve either a lot of sweat equity or retreatment. So you have to be careful about how you dispose if you're cutting this stuff back. They, like I said before, they're prolific fruiters. There's seed. You can't just toss this stuff in a compost pile. You have to throw it away in regular trash. And limited success with using herbicides. So that's the kind of information I used to fill out this petition. I did get it submitted on the 28th of, June. I submitted it on behalf of the Invasive Plant Working Group here at the University of Florida. The meeting was set 2 months later. We invited Jessica Spencer, Rick O'Connor to join us just because of their experience working with this plant as well. So they participated in some of the question and answers once we really got into talking about it. It was pretty easy process with this one. It was a unanimous vote to include beach Vitex in the noxious weed list. And the room was, the consensus was that this was really important to regulate now, just because it seems like we're at this early stage of invasion. So much of what I do personally in terms of prediction and diagnosis of invasion of these plants in Florida can be so frustrating, because by the time it's on our radar, it might be too late to do much about it. So I think the group seemed to be pretty excited about getting this early. So now this is off to tally. This is that gray area for me. But once it gets included, we can expect to see beach Vitex, Japanese honeysuckle, and the cat's claw vine to be included on that list, hopefully in December. So I'm just gonna go a little off, well, it's on topic for beach Vitex, but off topic for noxious weed listing. But I've been working with some other folks to kind of work on some other projects to try to bring awareness about Vitex, beach Vitex. And we, I partnered with folks from the Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve and the state park there on St. George Island, Brian Pelk there with the Nature Conservancy. Caitlin Snyder was my from ANERR. And we put on an EDRR workshop about beach Vitex. And we had a very nice turnout. I think we had 20 or 30 people show up. Most folks work for the state parks or were volunteers like AmeriCorps volunteers, just folks who might come into contact with this plant. And in the morning we put on, I gave about an hour-long talk about Vitex. And then Brian gave a talk about how to take a good EdMaps point location record. And then we all got in our trucks and cars and went across we were in East Point at the reserve. We just crossed the bridge, went over to St. George Island, and just did some hands-on stuff. Everybody got out and, touched it, looked at it. We, looked at it in different habitats. Up top here is Josh Hodson, park manager there on St. George Island, holding one of the branches. You can see a group down here. We're looking at that Vitex growing up in the rocks. This is actually along the side of a road. So people got a chance to really see it in person. One thing I hadn't thought about, in my interactions with this plant is that it's a member of the mint family. So really getting down there and like messing with the plant, if you break the leaves and stuff, it smells like mint, which I didn't really know until I touched it. So, when in doubt, that's another way you can identify the plant. Here's another, I love this picture of Josh holding up. That's just one runner. So, I mean, this is on across the road from the ocean side, but if something like this got a hold, really took hold on the dunes, you can see where it might be a problem for some of those ground nesting birds and sea turtles. So just personal next steps with my involvement, thinking about educating about Vitex, beach Vitex is we're just going to continue the outreach. Caitlin is working on a sort of front and back flyer about beach Vitex specific to Franklin County. And we have 3 known populations on St. George Island, and one of those homeowners is notoriously stubborn and resistant to treat. So we're hoping to be able to, hand these out to, these homeowners so they can consider removing it, and if not removing it, maybe just clipping back those fruits before they make it into, that sort of seed pool. And then I've been talking a little bit with Jake Farrell out at the Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants. One thing that was, he was in the room as one of the experts for the noxious weed listing. And, they're considering or thinking about maybe developing better research to determine better management control. And then we're also thinking, once it's listed, at least in Franklin County, of going to the local government, going to a county commission meeting, and urging them to implement further regulation. Once something's listed as noxious weed, it doesn't mean you have to remove it from your yard. But if there's further regulation, placing something on a noxious weed list, you can have some of those more local regulations to get folks to remove it. And the reason why this species was done, the risk assessment was done by the USDA, was because it's being considered for a national listing. So you know, it's my understanding that the more a species is placed on some of the state lists, this really helps them on a national level. So by us getting beach Vitex on a Florida state list, I believe it's either North or South Carolina. I think it's South Carolina where it's listed. That helps make the case for a national listing of the species. So that's good news. And just a short plug for the IFAS assessment, if you haven't seen it, this is how you access our website, and email me if you have any questions about anything invasion or risk assessment related. If you click contact us, those emails go right to me as well. And then this is just a quote from the risk assessment that the USDA did. You know, basically, this plant, you know, this says 25 years. Within 10 years of being introduced to the United States, it started showing its invasion capabilities and started taking over some areas in the Carolinas. And it was intentionally introduced to stabilize dunes. And, you know, with one of these introductions that was intentional, with the best intentions, but it just didn't end up being a good idea. And then I'll just thank Rick O'Connor and Jessica Spencer for their help in putting this stuff together and getting this plant listed. And that's, I can take any questions.
Great, thank you, Deah. So yeah, if anyone has questions, please go ahead and unmute yourself or type it in the chat box. I'll go ahead and I have a little bit of additional commentary and then a few questions myself. I just thought I would, two interesting things. So this plant actually is native to Hawaii. So I wonder with a national listing, if there would just have to be an exemption or something, because this is a plant that they actually would promote in Hawaii as a, you know, restoration or native plant landscaping plant. And then I was with the First Coast Invasive Working Group yesterday. They had one of their meetings, and so Deah talked a lot about kind of what's going on the West Coast with beach Vitex, and I know First Coast has presented a number of times on these calls, and we send out some information. But just real quickly, on the East Coast of Florida, as far as we know, there's only one plant in Nassau County at Fort Clinch State Park, which has been known about for a long time and has been under constant treatment. And then there's 2 or 3 established plants in St. Johns County that are next to the Guantanamo and Kansas National Estuarine Research Reserves beaches, but they are on private property. So Jessica Spencer and Caitlin Dietz, who co-chair the First Coast Invasive Working Group, are working directly with those private homeowners. And they said, Caitlin mentioned yesterday that they recently had a new plant reported, and if I'm getting the story right, when they approached the homeowner, they actually, the homeowner was actually recommended the plant as dune restoration by a contractor. So I think, you know, to me, part of having these things listed is exciting in the sense of, and shows the need to kind of, once this actually officially is on the list, to do some outreach to folks like contractors to let them know, like, hey, you know, this isn't a good recommendation. So that's kind of where things are on the East Coast. And, you know, this work supports that effort as well. And so I just had a few questions. Deah, you mentioned that kind of the way you guys decided to go forward with Japanese honeysuckle and cat's claw vine was through a FLEPPC working group, and you have like a prioritized list. So what do you feel like, are you guys going to continue like working down that list, or do you have any next goals for continuing to do petitions or anything like that?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly where we are with this, but the other 6 species. So what we did was we sort of narrowed it down to, you know, put an open call out to the board. What do you think should be on the list? And basically gave them sort of some criteria. really, again, thinking about what getting something listed is going to mean for that plant. And so, you know, going in with an attitude of like, let's get a bunch of stuff listed isn't really the right way to do it. But thinking more about what listing is going to do to impact that invasion. And so sort of deterred them from things like, you know, widespread invaders that we have, you know, well, not just at UF, but elsewhere, like active breeding programs for sterile cultivars of lantana. The odds of getting something like lantana camara listed are pretty low. And if we were to get it listed, then it makes development of sterile cultivars very difficult because they have to get exemptions and all these things. And so just sort of gave them some guidelines to think about what it would mean. And so we came up with eight species, ranked them. We took the top 2 that were kind of low-hanging fruit, just to learn the process, really. And I believe other petitions are in some form of being finished. Those sort of got farmed out from my duties as the legislative chair. But we have one of the tuberous sword ferns, wisteria, nandina, those kind of things. So there is an effort. I'm just not sure where we are with that.
Sure, that's great, thank you. And that actually, you kind of answered my second question about, you know, if a species was listed, would that affect the development of sterile cultivars? Because I know personally, anytime I've done outreach and we kind of just on invasive plants in general, and we start with like, okay, here's these lists, here's what's actually regulated, and then here's the situation. Kind of one of the first questions we always get is, you know, well, why aren't lantana and Mexican botania listed? And that that point about the development of sterile cultivars and how that would hinder that is really interesting. And I'll definitely add that to my little piece of how to answer that question. So let's see. So Alex shared an article quoting somebody in Melbourne who mentions beach vitex in the dunes. So we'll look at that. We have had other people, like when we've sent out early detection and rapid response notices on this plant, we've had some people report it and it's turned out not to be that. So we'll definitely, I will shoot that to Jessica and Caitlin, and we will.
Yeah, I'll just throw this out there. One of the projects we're working on at the IFAS assessment is, you know, that weed risk assessment I showed from the USDA. We're testing that model for Florida. And one of the things about that model is it sort of divorces the geographic suitability from the risk prediction and puts that into a separate part of the model. So you predict your establishment and spread, and your uncertainty is sort of determined. And then you use GIS mapping model to determine if it will grow in your area. And we don't have the finished maps for Vitex. We're still working on the model. But the maps that I hired a GIS analyst, the maps that he's completed, the preliminary ones, it looks like Vitex is technically suitable to go all the way around from Texas to Connecticut along the coast. But that very tip of Florida, the most tropical part of Florida, it doesn't look like it's quite as suitable down there. And from what I've heard, a lot of the false reporting is in South Florida, and it's the other Vitex, like the chast tree, getting misidentified as beach Vitex. That's what I've heard.
Yeah, thank you. So are there any other questions? I'll give you just a few seconds if you have one to unmute or type it in. And again, you can always reach out to Deah or myself and I can connect you. Thank you, Deah, so much for joining us today and sharing this work. You know, I think we all really appreciate understanding the process a little more and just the work that you and Rick and Jessica, and then your fellow folks on the team in FLEPPC have been doing on this. So thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. And just one more thing I'll throw out is if anyone is thinking about listing a plant and wants to look at one of the packets that we put together, I'm happy to talk with you and share.
Awesome, great. So moving on, let's see if I can, there we go. So I just want to wrap up today by sharing some upcoming events and some save the dates getting into 2020. So as you can see, we've got a pretty full calendar going into fall for CISMA activities. The heat is starting to break in some parts of the state at least, and so activity picks up. This week, actually tomorrow, the Florida Keys has an exotics ID class, and Southwest Florida CISMA has a subcommittee meeting. North Central Florida will be meeting next week. And on October 8th, Suncoast CISMA has a grasses ID class, which filled up, as far as I know, within hours of being advertised. These grass ID classes have a pretty high demand across the state. There is an FWC Exotic Pest Amnesty Day coming up on October 12th in Fort Walton Beach. So they're connected with Six Rivers CISMA, who will hopefully work with them to have some education there. October 15th through 17th is the Florida Aquatic Plant Management Society Annual Conference. October 16th, eCISMA has a steering committee meeting. There's another grass and sedge identification workshop scheduled for October 29th. This one is the 3 or 4 of the Central Florida CISMAs working together on this one, and this one also filled up very quickly and has a waiting list, I believe, of up to about 50 people. Again, demonstrating the demand for grasses and sedges. They're just hard for a lot of us, I know. Heartland CISMA has a couple really cool workshops coming up on October 30th. It's a field workshop, so they're going to be visiting a site that has been heavily mined and looking at native grass restoration there. And then on November 19th, they have another field workshop in a different location where they're going to be doing some invasive ID and look-alike native plant type education. And then on October 30th as well, Treasure Coast has a Halloween count that they're doing. And so all these events are available on our website, on our events page. I will say we're having some glitches with the website this week, but we're working on it. So not all the stuff I'm putting on the calendar is showing up, but I'm in communication with Bugwood, and we're working on resolving that. We're also experiencing some weird reversal of pages. So pages that we've updated are reverting to previous updates, and so not all the information is there. So if you're a frequent visitor of our website and you ever notice you can't find something that you're pretty sure was there before, please let me know. Again, I'm working closely with Sarah Jean on this, and she's fabulous, and she is helping resolve these little glitches. But just in case you are a frequent visitor, as I am, if you ever notice that, shoot me an email so we can make sure we get that resolved. All right, so first big save the date, Monday, February 24th through Saturday, February 29th will be, I'm not 100% sure about National Invasive Species Awareness Week, but it is always the last week of February. So we are holding that date for Florida Invasive Species Awareness Week. And one of our efforts this year is going to be to kind of rebrand. We will still, promote the idea as being in concert with NISA, but similar to what Washington State and Hawaii do, it's going to be kind of a Florida Invasive Species Awareness Week in tangent with NISA. So we will host our second annual statewide weed wrangle. If you are able to host an event on Saturday, February 29th, that's kind of a great point date for especially getting volunteers from the community. But last year, and this worked just fine, we had CISMAs whose efforts really, they were mainly able to do things on weekdays, so we ended up having weed wrangles throughout the week, and we'll do that again this year. So I just want to make sure, start thinking about your potential sites, and we will talk more about this on our next call. We'll outline the planning efforts for Florida Invasive Species Awareness Week in 2020. And then also, hopefully you've seen this in email, but we got the save the dates for the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council annual meeting. That's going to be March 25th through 27th. And I'm really excited about the topic, measuring success in invasive plant management. This is something that a lot of us talk about a lot, and it's a challenge, but I think a lot of programs are working towards better communicating their impacts and why it's important. So this is a key component of that. So I'm excited about the topic, as I hope you all are. Our annual CISMA workshop, which always corresponds with the FLEPPC meeting, will be on March 24th, so the day before the actual FLEPPC programming starts. Especially for CISMA leads, please go ahead and kind of pencil this in. And we'll be sharing more information about this on the October call as well. And this is going to be in the same location as last year in Daytona. And so make sure you get those dates on your calendar now. And then our next call is October 23rd, and we are going to kind of look back on 2019, kind of share some information and success stories, and then we're going to focus on some 2020 planning. So as I mentioned, especially looking at Florida Invasive Species Awareness Week and the upcoming CISMA meeting and FLEPPC conference. Remember, we do not have calls in November and December. It's kind of holiday time, so we don't have calls then. I'm currently working on the 2020 schedule of calls. We've got some exciting topics coming up for you. Hopefully I'll be able to share at least the first quarter of topics in October, but I'm kind of already getting excited about the presentations that we're gonna have in the next year. So with that, thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. I want to thank our presenter, Dr. Deah Lieurance, again for sharing that work. And as she mentioned, if you have any questions or would like more information on that process, feel free to reach out to her. Or if you have my contact, you can reach out to me and I can forward it along. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your week and we'll talk to you again soon. Goodbye.